a company that has done some remarkable work in the area of gene technology. One of the things they have is a product called AlloMap, which replaces an invasive, augments an invasive heart catheterization to find out after heart transplant whether the heart is in danger of rejection. It doesn't totally replace that, but it does give a risk factor. And so it's been amazing for us with heart transplants to be able to have a blood draw as opposed to something going down through the groin, up into the heart, picking off tissues, et cetera, if it wasn't needed. And that was needed before. And so it's an amazing technology. And what I've asked David to do, the same thing we did last year, and that is that, this is not an advertising for your company or your product. Tell us about the technology that's behind this that we're going to see in the years to come applied to other environments, other transplants, for example. And so with that invitation, I want to say that David came through. We had an opportunity to sponsor our 2 lunches, and that was $1,500. And David said, we'll take the 2 lunches, but we want to increase the donation to $2,500 to cover those 2 lunches. So that's the kind of friend we have in David. And I got to say, David, welcome, and share your passion.
Thank you.
Well, you gave it $2,500 and they've been eating. They're happy.
First question I'm going to ask, are there any molecular biologists in the room?
You're safe.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those where I have an engineering degree and I do marketing. Why they ever let engineers do marketing is beyond me, but I think I'm pretty good at it. It's only because I have some people skills and I can talk a little bit. And a little bit, you'll hear about XDX, but how many people know about AlloMap? That's good. Now, we're going to go through this, and I'm going to use a lot of examples about this, but it's not an AlloMap commercial one little bit. We're going to talk about things such as personalized medicine and companion diagnostics. Anybody read the newspaper? Good. There's a lot of participation here, and I am going to quiz you on a couple things. Anybody read last week that they found that there's a biomarker in breast cancer tumors, and they can determine exactly which type of tumor it is, and they've kind of classified it into 4 of them. Based upon this, what they're doing is they're coming up and saying, based upon that classification, we know which meds to give those people the chemotherapy. So we're going to talk about a lot of this stuff, but it's in the news all the time. You'll see lots of words. You can't go through the newspaper without looking about gene expression, biomarkers, RNA, DNA. So I'm going to give you a little that's why I was asking about the molecular biology. It's been a long time since I went back to school. So I'll give you a little bit of information about this. But we'll cover all of these. So if there's anything on here, by the end of the presentation, go, David, you didn't handle this. We're going to deal with it, okay? So why biomarkers? There are studies that say it reduces the use of chemotherapy by 34%. Think about that. What does that do if you can reduce that? Because chemotherapy essentially is toxins that they're putting into the system. If you can reduce that when you're treating women for breast cancer, isn't that remarkable? There are a lot of new drugs coming out here. They're saying we want to use these with biomarkers along the way. And about 10% marketing saying in their package labels, you want to check it by doing this. These are called companion diagnostics. There's a couple companies out there that the pharmaceutical companies and the diagnostic companies are getting together and saying, we're creating this drug, but we need you to create this diagnostic test to go along with it. Now, in the case of AlloMap, what it is you guys are on your immunosuppression drugs. We've been approached and said, by the way, can you help us so that we can minimize the amount of immunosuppression that the heart transplant patients can have later on. So it's kind of one of those where the pharmaceutical companies are partnering up with the diagnostic companies. Now, probably the most remarkable is the cost to healthcare. We always hear about that as the largest thing on the GMP is healthcare. This is one of those where using biomarkers, you can determine what is the right drug for the right patient, what's the right screening for the right patient. And in this particular case, just in colorectal cancer, it could possibly save $600 million in a year. Think about that. So if we can find some more ways of targeting exactly what we want to do. Right now, what do? You know the old song, put the lime in the coconut and call me in the morning? Essentially, it's trial and error type of medicine. Here, let's try this drug. Tell me if it doesn't work. We'll make another appointment in a couple weeks. And you come back and go, doctor, this pain, it's still there. What are we going to do about it? Well, there's a couple aspects. Is it the right drug? Are you metabolizing that correctly? And, or, you know, is it the right treatment for that particular ailment? So there's a lot of savings, cost savings, both from the patient side, but also from the financial side. So XDX, we have to put it there. Nobody knows it's an XDX. Everybody knows this as AlloMap. And essentially what we have is 11 active genes and 9 control genes, and that is used to determine about whether a person is rejecting their heart or not. And we'll go through a little bit of our discovery process along the way of how we got down to those 11. But there are lots of other companies out here. Anybody heard of 23andMe?
Nope.
Essentially, they do a swab of your saliva. They send it off to a company, I believe it's in Fremont, up near the San Francisco Bay Area, and they give you an entire profile of what's happened to you. Tell you about some of your heritage. It's actually, I think it's $200, and they can give you an entire look at what your, not the whole genotype, but it really does look at a lot of the information that they give you. And why is it called 23andMe? Chromosomes. That's a question. These next ones, they're all around cardiovascular disease. Who's at risk for cardiovascular disease? Have you had a stroke? Have you had some of the markers within you has changed based upon heart attacks and strokes? So there's a lot of money being researched. And you'll notice there's a lot of really good names. Cleveland Heart Labs is associated with the Cleveland Clinic. Berkeley, of course, is Berkeley. So there's a lot of good research behind this. Exact Sciences is actually looking at fecal material. They're looking for biomarkers to look for colorectal cancer up in Wisconsin. Areas in the Bay, and this is nowhere exclusive, they're looking at neonatal. Rather than doing amniocentesis, they're looking at using blood and trying to find out if there's any genetic issues going on with the fetus. You got Genomic Health and Millennium. They're actually more of that partnering type of thing. The companion diagnostics, which is, you know, you have a disease state. Now, is this the right drug for that particular population of people? So it's more of that personalized type of thing. In the case of Millennium, they're looking at pain management or people with chronic pain. And are they metabolizing correctly, and or is it the right drug for that particular, to handle that particular pain? And the last one is Ventana, which actually is a Roche company, but they are partnered with Novartis or all these other companies, where this is a prime example of where the pharmaceutical companies are going with the diagnostic company, and they're partnering up and making personalized companion medicine. So here's the quiz. This is going to take about 5 minutes. What is a biomarker? It's some cellular, biochemical, and molecular alterations that are measurable tissue or body fluids. Saliva, tears, blood, urine, fecal. And it's something that says something is changing within your body. How many diabetics are here? What do they check you? It's really a biomarker. Now, you got your glucose, but then there's the A1C, a biomarker. What they're saying is there's something that happens to this hemoglobin that it gets glycated. And the longer it goes and the more control you are, guess what happens? That is a biomarker that's actually telling you it's how well you're controlling your glucose. So,
and the amazing thing for those who aren't diabetic is supposedly that shows them your patterns for the past 30 days of sugar levels. I don't know how.
Yep.
Maybe you do.
I'll let the microbiologist do that one. But essentially that is a biomarker. Complicated slide. Way up here you have your genome. Your genome, way up the top, that's the nucleus of the cell. And the genome is actually all your little chromosomes that are floating around in there. The chromosomes, there's 23 of those, and they're made up of the DNA. And of the DNA, you have a little bit of genes that are going across it. Your DNA makes the RNA. So your DNA, that tells you, blonde hair, blue eyes, male, female. So it really is It's, so your DNA really is static. Your RNA is the thing that changes. So when you're talking about gene expression, things like that, you're really talking about the dynamic portion of that when you're getting there. Okay, quiz. How many?
23.
23. I got a tougher one coming down. Just wait. Okay? So your DNA, that is what's carrying your genetic material, and your human genome, as they're called, which is the entire set of all your DNA. No, there's not going to be a quiz on this. But if think about it, this, you could do an entire makeup of all the genes that are within your body, and that would be called your human genome. Your genes are your coding instructions, either your DNA or RNA. AlloMap uses what's called gene expression. So essentially, we're taking this down and breaking it into little subparticles. We're taking your DNA and your RNA, bringing it down to little bitty snippets of information, and called RNA or proteins. Now, this is the question. How many genes are in the human body?
3 billion.
25,000 to 30,000. So, there are even some statistics that says that it could possibly be as much as 100,000. So think about from an AlloMap standpoint, we use 11. And I'll explain a little bit later how we get down to that 11. But if you think about it, this thing is huge, and what they're doing is taking these little pieces and parts, which one's linked to breast cancer, prostate cancer, which one's dealing with your heart rejection, kidney rejection. So it kind of goes into some other facets of along the way. And RNA actually is you'll hear a messenger or transfer RNA, and these are broken down into your genes and also your proteins. And then proteins. So you got your DNA, your RNA, and your protein. Okay, now let's get to the good stuff, right? So what are the questions? Who has the potential? I mean, some of it is lifestyle. Some of it is a phenotype or what they look like. But if you think about it, that's real easy. You are a walking heart attack. But there are other ones. Do anybody recognize him? Okay, this is a very young picture.
Tom Cruise.
Tom Cruise?
Davy
No.
Jones.
No.
Davy Jones.
Monkeys.
Davy Jones.
Davy Jones, exactly. What did he die of?
Heart attack.
Heart attack at the age of 66. His daughter said he had a physical 1 month prior, and he had a heart of a 17-year-old. How did that happen? How is that possible? Did he possibly just have a propensity to have a heart attack? It didn't have anything to do with his cholesterol was fine, his heart was fine. It's just something in his genetic makeup that made him a little bit more sensitive to this. And there's stories like that. Frank Shorter. I mean, there's sometimes you hear about people that they, on a football field, perfect shape. Frank Shorter. He was a major runner. What did he die of? Heart attack. If a guy can do a marathon, his heart should be working pretty damn good. What do you think? So who's at risk, really, is they can look at it, who's at risk of cancer? You've heard of oncogenes? Everybody hear about oncogenes? Essentially what that is some people are walking around and saying they have a propensity for cancer. I have 2 brothers. Both of them had cancer. So they did a blood test. They go, okay, we're going to do a blood test. We're going to store it. If you ever have cancer, call the Cleveland Clinic and tell us. They're looking at the oncogenes. This was in 1983 they were looking at this. But essentially, there are some people that just have a predisposition to cancer. There's other ones of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. You hear of families where the male never makes it past the age of 45. Do you think there's a propensity for cardiovascular disease? And along the way can they determine that, predict it? Who are you going to screen for it? High-risk pregnancy. You hear about the people, they just can't get pregnant, or when they have a pregnant, they just have very difficult ones. Can you predict that? There's companies that are doing this. And there's a whole slew of other ones between Alzheimer's and cystic fibrosis. They can determine this when it's a child, not until you start getting the symptoms. Now, why do they want to know that? Who do they screen? If you look at colorectal cancer, they've done some phenomenal things in the last 10 years. One of the things is they determine who to screen using a fecal cold blood test, or they use something a little bit more invasive, which is a colonoscopy, and that's due to family history. Colorectal cancer is one of those diseases that has a family history. Along the way is, if you find out if they could have gotten to Davy Jones a little bit earlier, could they have changed his diet? Could they have done some things that really could have elongated his life past the age of 66? Or could they reverse that mutation within that? And along the way, as long as they find the core, the root cause, what can they do? They now can do research to figure out, can we change what is going on within the RNA, within that gene? So once you find that root cause and you're able to detect it and who to do that, the world's wide open and you can do a lot more research. In the case of genomic health, this is a prime one up here where they're looking at those populations of patients and saying, who do we use this chemotherapy on? Who do we use this therapy on? And along the way, it's that trial and error. We've all heard of people that had cancer. They tried this one, they go back a couple months later, it didn't shrink. They try a different one. And it's this whole trial and error thing that if you can personalize the treatment for that particular patient, what are you going to have? Better outcomes, right? The other one is it the right dosage? Not everybody metabolizes drugs the same. In the case of pain medications, you always hear people like, oh my God, I have back pain, I need more of it. And you kind of go, okay, are you selling it? Are you not taking it? What's going on here? And you find out that they're just metabolizing it differently. In the case of heart rejection, what we find out is people, all of you, metabolize immunosuppression drugs differently. Matter of fact, that's one of the studies that we're doing is under steroid response, is you can actually look at the patients and say these people will metabolize the steroids a little bit differently than other people. And by that, you can, do I need to increase it? Do I need to decrease it? And more personalized because we know there's long-term effects with the immunosuppressions. So that's another one that they're really looking at. What's the stage of the disease? If you find out what the stage is, you know how to treat the disease. How advanced is it? Has it gone from an infection into a tissue destruction? And at that point, you can look and say, I need to do this a little bit more aggressively, or I need to pull back a little bit. This is a big one for colorectal cancer, and that actually is a section for colorectal cancer. Am I going too fast for you? You guys with me?
No, it's good.
Okay. So it is one of those. What really is? You hear this. Take 2, call me in the morning. Try this, make an appointment in 2 weeks. Let's see if that works. Eliminates that trial and error medicine. They do that all the time. What's the cost? How many visits do you have to do till they get it right? It's a pain to the patient. If I can imagine from a healthcare professional, is they're like, I want to see more patients. I can see more patients if I'm not having to do this. It reduces the side effects. Every medication has a side effects. It has those black boxes. So if you can reduce those side effects, then you have less to treat. What a novel concept. The patient's better, healthcare providers are better, the clinicians are better, the healthcare system as a whole is better. Improve the outcomes, and of course reduce the healthcare costs. So that's why they're going into biomarkers. Let's go through the discovery process. Start at 30,000 genes, right? So how did XDX in all their wisdom, and this was 10 years ago, how did they figure out what were the ones they need to look at? They found about 340 that really were tied to T-cell. They had to study a little bit, but they really did. I had some very smart people that said, okay, this is around the rejection, that graft versus host. And then, well, wait a minute, there's also some platelet and some erythrocytes. So there's some other ones we have to look at. So here's some things that are kind of common. So he took it down to 340. They captured a whole bunch of blood from all across the United States, brought it in, and they got it down to about 68 different genes. So they looked at it and said, okay, we're eliminating almost 300 of those. We're down to 68. And then they get the biostatisticians in there, and they just crunched numbers. And they got it down to 11 active genes that looks at a person, a stable patient, says, you are not rejecting your heart. At a 98% confidence level, you are not rejecting your heart. Think about that. They went from 30,000, took it down to 11, and said, this is how you're doing it. Now, XDX is also working on kidney and liver, so it's, we're getting there. But they're going through that same process. We have samples and samples, refrigerators full of these, and they keep going to that. I'm trying to find out which is the one. And in this case, is it kind of is there scientific or is there biostatistician? There's two of them for T-cell priming, which essentially is that graft versus host. Erythrocyte, which means, I have some blood cells and they're increasing. Platelet response, which actually makes sense, and steroid response. There's two of those. We kind of know what they're for, but we have no idea. There's nothing, they're not tied to anything that you can kind of go, that makes sense in that graft versus host, where the patient is looking at that heart and saying if it's right or wrong. But there's a very good correlation with those. And we haven't changed this recipe in 10 years. But that's the one of, part of it is scientific and part of it is there's 30,000 genes and we may never know what all of them do. Let's look at the financial considerations. Back in 2001, to do that human genome, essentially, yeah, exactly, that's staggering. $300 million to do the very first one. Part of that is they didn't have the technology. They were doing it all by hand. They're trying to figure out, they started out with about 11,000 and they went up and said, okay, wait a minute, that's 11,000 genes. They went a little bit higher and said, wait a minute, there's a combination of genes and proteins here, which are the right ones. And then to totally map the entire thing was about 300,000. Today, it's only about $5,000.
Wow.
So other than those companies that I have listed up there, there's tons of people that are providing diagnostic equipment and tips and reagents that allow this to happen at a lot lower cost. So this has created an entire industry out there. But I think it's amazing that it goes from, in just 10 years, what's the difference? But now you understand why it's important. In the last 5 years, just the investment in biomarkers and also the emergence of companies along the way has increased 75%. It's just gotten huge. Now think about that. It doesn't sound like a lot. When I first looked at it, 75%. But what was the cost 2001 to now? It just cost a whole lot less to do it, but we have a whole bunch more companies, and we're looking at a lot more disease states. And that's what it looks like. And so when I asked about the molecular biologists, they probably can look at this and say, oh, I know exactly what that is and what it means. Now, we have major equipment down in our lab that does this for us. And we have some very smart people that do it for us. Remember, I'm the marketing guy. So let's look at it. The first thing is, it's not patentable. So XDX has discovered these 20. We have an array. We give out a number. You can't patent an ear or an eye or a nose. You can't patent a gene. They just aren't. Think about that. I create a company, I invest the money into it, and I can't protect it. What, could easily be copied. And new biomarkers, those 30,000, or the combinations, are being discovered every single day. New ones are. And along the way, it's like, I think this one might be, cardiopathy. Oh, wait a minute, this one might be connected to that. And can that one be put into the mix? That's why there's so many cardiovascular companies out there. All of them have a different risk stratification strategy and a little different profile of what they're looking at. How do you know which one's right or which one's wrong? Outcomes, studies. XDX, we did two studies, one called Cargo that was for 5 years, and we did MH, which was another 5 years. And along the way, it cost about $20 million each to do each one of those. So now, you do that study, and somebody comes along, and they just added one more marker to it. And it's not patentable. So you kind of go, there's a lot of risk for a lot of people here. If you think about it from an industry standpoint. The equipment is huge. As we've seen, that's what lowers the cost. But it really is a great investment along the way. And clinicians are slow to adopt. So right now, for AlloMap, everybody agrees that a blood test is better than a biopsy. There's about 120 heart transplant centers in the United States. How many do you think use AlloMap?
50.
Higher. 100.
100.
We still have 20 people that don't use AlloMap. It makes sense, doesn't it? There are other financial comfort levels, things that they look at and they go, we don't accept that technology. We're in the ISHLT guidelines. Clinicians are slow to adopt. They just want to be, they want it proven. Even though we're in the guidelines, we have the major study, they're just slow. Now here's the big one. Payers are slow to pay.
Well, David, let me just ask a question right there. How much of that resistance has been or is now for those other? The fact that you're replacing a very expensive revenue income procedure with a blood test.
That's true.
I mean, if you're in a hospital and you got to make money, right? All of a sudden this guy says, hey, for $3,000 you can do what we're charging these people $25,000 to do. My God, there's $25,000 I'm not bringing in.
We do hear that every day.
I'm sure you do. How do you overcome that?
Put it back to the patient. What's right for the patient? What is right for the patient?
And I hope every one of our business managers, not the physicians, in those hospitals think the same way.
Yeah, not necessarily. But I think that's with any technology, they want to have to prove it. The difference is, the only way to tell you that you are rejecting is a biopsy. What we do is we stratify the patient, say these guys are stable. 64% of them are stable. Those are the ones that we want to target an AlloMap. Why put them to the risk of doing a biopsy? The possible perforations, the tamponades, just the anxiety along the way. Why put them through that if you don't have to? And the physicians, the ones that are holding out, are saying, but you don't tell me you're rejecting, you're just telling me you're not rejecting. They look fine. Why would you do that? So, but along the way, is we do have some doctors that sit there and say, oh, by the way, I have 2 kids in private school, you are not taking my biopsy revenue away.
Now put that in perspective. Those who have had hearts, how many heart catheterizations have we had to get a biopsy in that first year alone? Something like 20? And they're not cheap. Take that revenue away with a blood test. Got to do some powerful marketing there, David.
Yep. But we are in 100 of those 120 centers. There's 20,000 living heart transplant patients in the U.S. We have 10,000 of those on AlloMap. So we're making headways. It's just we do have some holdups.
What's the saturation international?
We have just gone into Germany, Switzerland, Vienna, and Italy. So we are just gone in there. But to parallel, they have about 2,000 transplants a year, heart transplants, and we have about 2,000 heart transplants a year. That answer your question?
Yes.
So we just gone.
Do you just do hearts, or are you working with lung transplant?
Right now, we just do heart. We actually have studies in lung, kidney, and liver. And also we have some adjuncts to look at steroid response for the heart transplant. So now that we've taken that, can we take a subset of that to determine how you should be doing your immunosuppression optimization for that particular patient?
How long will you figure you'll be catching up with the other organs?
Our husband just got lung transplant
Yep,
7 months
exactly.
ago. You were here.
That's probably an 18-month down the road. Yeah. And we're also working with lupus. Yes.
With the hearts, you're replacing a very intrusive and expensive task. What are you replacing for kidney, pancreas?
Good question. With the kidney, what happens is they very rarely who's got kidney and how many biopsies have you had. So it's one of those where you don't have a lot of biopsies because that's like the last thing. But the problem is they're looking at different blood tests, but that already is showing destruction of the kidney at that point should they get to there. So if we can do a predictive type of value that we're doing with AlloMap, that would provide a value to the market.
But when would they do an AlloMap? What would cause a doctor to do an AlloMap on a kidney patient?
They do an AlloMap on the hearts right along with their routine clinic visits.
Right, but I think her
so
question
it'd be
is.
just one more blood test.
Yeah, it'd be one. It's one or two, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
And don't they also do, I thought they did both, so I thought you had to have the biopsy and the AlloMap to really confirm that it's accurate.
I was in that phase where the doctor didn't trust it yet, so they're comparing to see how valid AlloMap was. I've seen in many practices. That's what's going on there. You don't need them both, but for a doctor to finally get to a point where he trusts this new technology, he wants to see how his old practice versus the new one would work.
Yeah, that's why they never would use LMR for me.
Yep.
But clinicians are very slow to adopt. They don't want these. I mean, you hear about electronic medical records. A lot of doctors are resistant to that and staff. So it's a matter of, they're just, I mean, the biopsy is 30, 40 years they've been using it.
I had another question about, you do the gene mapping, whatever it is, the biomarkers, but aren't there things that can turn genes on and off, and how do you account for those?
Correct. It depends on what it is. That's why the gene selection is very important, of which ones turn on and which ones turn off. That's why they've done a lot of studies say which ones have a higher correlation to whatever that disease state you're looking for. In the case of like the pain management ones, they were probably looking at those ones of which ones are turning on and which ones are turning off. Or the other is which a proto-oncogene is prior to it being turned on. I mean, it's like which one is going to turn on next, but they don't know what the trigger is, the catalyst. Did you have a question?
Yes. I don't know how far afield this is. How many of those 100
Go ahead.
facilities are for-profit or not-for-profit?
Great question. I've done that market research, and there's no correlation between those. There really isn't. What we notice is that the larger ones, because of bureaucracy and how many people are in the decision-making process, it seems a little bit more difficult than the smaller ones. So we found actually it's correlated to size and not necessarily to whether they're academic or they're for-profit. Allie, do you have a question?
Do you think you'll be changing the test at all to develop it? Because like right now, it's the predictability that you'll reject and not that you
The negative predictability, the rule in versus the rule out is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yes, that will be a different product, and yes, we are looking at trying to come up with something that's more of a rule-in test to say that you're rejecting, like a biopsy does, versus a rule-out test, which says you're a stable patient, you're looking good.
How long, like about how long is?
Probably about 18 months.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's gonna be a while. Okay, the other is payers. Payers are slow to adopt. We have we have an entire team that's looking at, and we're not alone here, because there's a lot of I'm from San Francisco. There's a lot of these biotech companies up in San Francisco. We have a coalition of trying to go after some of these payers to get us to pay for the test. Because when you first start out, is you don't have a code that says heart rejection. So what you have to do is you have to go through their whole system, put a price on it, they come back and negotiate, and in some cases they go, no, we're just not going to pay for it.
They'd rather pay the expense of a heart biopsy
Yes, they
than a
would.
blood test?
Yep, because what they will not tell Johns Hopkins, we will not pay you. They'd rather tell XDX they won't pay them. Yes, we are so small on their radar. We're not alone in this. There's lots of companies out there that are trying to lobby. The other is, the government goes through and says, oh, by the way, if you do an AlloMap, you have to do it someplace else. You can't do it in the facility. So there's some other complications that the government has kind of put onto us to do this. And they're not isolating XDX or AlloMap. They're just slow to adopt. In my previous life, I was using immunochemical fecal occult blood test. And we got a CPT code, and I was amazed at, it's like, wait a minute, you do colorectal cancer screening, and you don't want to pay for it? You, Blue Cross Blue Shield, do not want to pay for this? It could potentially save tons of lives. Payers are just slow they will pay at the very last moment. So we have any people from insurance? Before I just bash them. And actually, we do go to like a lot of the insurance companies meetings also. And I have medical directors like, oh, I reject your test all the time. Why? Well, because I'm not going to reject the biopsy. You know, I'm not going to not pay for that. I'll pay for yours. And then that's what they told me. I have no problem of telling you no. I have a problem of telling our customer.
So why
Major
would they
institutions
pay
know.
for either or?
Yep.
So not turn down the one, especially like the doctor wants to do both because he's getting confidence in it. I mean, $3,000 versus, what a biopsy costs. And I got to believe, I never saw that,
between
but it's
5
in
to
the
15.
20.
5 to 15.
Only 5 to 15?
Yeah.
Man, I don't
But
think
still.
they got that low.
Yeah.
I was
was gonna ask, how, I mean, you're saying that you don't have a billing code for that yet.
Correct.
How would you go about getting it?
First, that's a great question. First, you have to go to the government and say, government, we would like a billing code. And they give you what's called a CPT code, or procedure text code. And you probably see them all the time because you get the explanation of benefits, right? First, you got to get that. And then you go to, then you got to get Medicare to pay for it, Medicaid. And then after that, you have to go to the respective insurance company and say, by the way, as the government's now paying for it, would you pay for it? And the government is great about paying this, by the way.
Yeah.
So it's a couple-stage process.
Yeah.
And at this point, we're not big enough. We're probably 10,000 a year. Where how many glucose do you think CPT codes do they have? Millions.
More than I.
Yeah.
Because I work with the codes
Yep.
on a daily basis, and I
So
often wonder how what kind of process you'd have to go through, because I do know that they do update and change them periodically as well to make them more inclusive of the ever-adapting tests that they're doing.
That's correct.
The procedures that they're doing.
Yeah, but it's just a long process, and we are in the stage of that.
Okay.
But if I go through all those ones that I listed, genomic health and CardioDX and area, and we're all in the same boat. We're going to CMS or Health and Human Services say we need a CPT.
So eventually I'll have one of those come across my desk.
Possibly, absolutely. Yes. Yes,
Is there an infection risk in a heart biopsy?
absolutely. Yep.
Isn't that something that one would play up?
Absolutely, yeah. But there are associated risks associated with biopsies. With any procedure, there's risk. Have you ever read the little disclosure statements? I go in just to have them look at skin, and this is possible infection. There's a whole slew of possible issues associated with any type of procedure. And it is an inherent radiation. If you're doing fluoroscopy during a heart biopsy, it's equivalent to almost 200 chest x-rays. Clinicians aren't worried about that. That is an inherent risk of that, of keeping that heart alive and keeping the patient alive.
They're also giving
And
a
I
contrast dye.
Pardon?
They're also, biopsy, they're giving a contrast dye.
Yep.
Which damages your kidneys.
I want to get back to that payer. Medicare still covers this stuff.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
And what about in the future of Medicare? How's that going to play out?
Right now, they have no changes because Medicare realizes that either they pay for the biopsy or they pay for the LMAP, and they realize that the LMAP for these stable patients, it is the right choice. So, okay, continue on. Good conversations. Let's look at the ethical future of biomarkers. I was actually kind of interested in this as we go forward. Treatment triage. Somebody comes in. Do they do blood work?
Always.
Why can't they do a quick DNA? You get this thing down, and they look at you and say, "Oh, wait a minute. You have some propensities here. You have some things. You know what? We're not going to treat you." They can make those particular decisions. What is your treatment based upon what you have? Right now, yes.
Can't insurance companies make that kind of same decision too, though?
Insurance companies don't normally want to tell institutions or clinicians how to practice medicine.
Well, no, I mean to cover certain people. And because I know in Ohio, I'm having a hard time getting insurance because they don't have to cover me.
But you're right. They could do this and determine who's going to be insurable or not. Absolutely. Clinical trials. Everybody wants great clinical trials. Pharmaceutical companies, diagnostic companies, we want these. What do we collect? Blood samples, urine samples. And if you do a DNA, guess what? You can actually cater it to that particular population of people so the side effects are less. That's a possible issue. Employment. Do you know there is a law? There is a genetic discrimination law that says you cannot discriminate based upon genetics.
Good.
But what happens if you're a small business owner and you do a DNA test and you find out they have the propensity for Alzheimer's, and you find out you get some good credentials, but no, we're not going to do that. Cardiovascular disease? Because if there's an event what's going to happen to your insurance as a small business owner? It goes up. So now that could be a while back, I worked for a Swedish company, and they had me do a handwriting sample. And that was part of my hiring process. I thought that was nuts. But to realize that they could actually look at your genetic, your human genome and go, this person's a good candidate or this one's not. Interesting kind of ethical question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mating. Who's my partner?
Hey,
You know what, as I get older, I don't want to be changing some.
I don't want to tell you to do that, but that sounds pretty good on the personal level.
You know what, it probably would be better than my own personal selection process, so maybe I should go into this. But it's one of those that if you think about it, it could be rather than, you know, what are your STDs, your medical records. By the way, what is your human genome? And at that point, that's how I select my mate or not.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds ruthless when you think about that.
But with a divorce rate of 50%, maybe that's better.
I should be using this. And you know what? You laugh about it, but you think I made that image?
Oh.
I found that on the internet. Offspring. You know this one is a touchy subject. I look at the baby, I look at the fetus, and I determine whether I want to or not. Not whether what's going to happen to them, you know, at birth. What's going to happen to them 50 years down the road? They're looking. You can look longer term, and it sounds silly until you realize that the first baby in Britain designed to be breast cancer free was born this year. That was not from the Inquirer.
Wow.
Which
What
tells
else
you
was this baby?
we're pardon?
What else was this baby designed to be?
Exactly. So if you think about it, we're worried about our children growing up, and are they slow? Are they gifted? Are they challenged? How are they labeled? And now you can look at this and go, I do an entire human genome on them, and I now label them as potential for cancer, potential for long-term diseases. And if you think about it, it raises some very interesting ethical questions.
Wow.
But wouldn't putting these labels on these children being born make them even more neurotic when they're
Oh, of
older?
course. I don't know if you guys can read all that, but you're absolutely right. So I don't know right now if I'm a walking time bomb for colorectal cancer, for leukemia, for prostate cancer.
But that would be hard for a child to either live up to or live down to whatever they're being told.
I didn't
Or
say it was
worse.
the right thing. I just said these are some ethical applications of biomarkers. So I just wanted to make you think about it.
Yeah.
And another one is I did not make that image. Somebody else did. But I thought this was a funny one to end on. You know what? Your heart's doing great. A little too good. Any questions on biomarkers or the future?
Wow. An amazing presentation. Look into the future, which is not so futuristic, is it? I mean, we're talking about things they're doing today, like AlloMap. We're talking about the discovery process into parallel procedures like that. And boy, those ethical issues have not been answered yet. Where are we going? We don't know. David, you've given us a lot to think about, a lot of information, and I got to compliment you. You've taken a very complex subject and brought it down to a level which I think most would say, well, I don't know if I can count 30,000 of them, but I understand the concept, and you applied it to our environments, for our various environments, especially the heart people, but now the others. Nicely done. That's why they take a marketeer and pair them up with the engineer to translate this into that, right?
Exactly.
And that's the gift.
Thank you.
David, thank you very much.